In terms of how we kind of first learned about summer melt, this really rewinds about 10 years now. I was still an administrator at the Met, and we had the opportunity at the time to work with a fantastic professor at Boston College named Karen Arnold to do a longitudinal study of our high school graduates. The Met, as many of you may know, is a pretty innovative and different high school curriculum, and so we wanted to see how students who went through this curriculum fared afterwards. And I think it's really important to understand the context in which the Met was, many of your schools were, and that we were doing this study. My recollection as an administrator who oversaw our college and transition staff at the Met in the mid-2000s was this was a time where, we really were trying to support every student to go to college, with more, I think, at the time, a focus on access than affordability, and certainly, I think, more of a focus on access than persistence or success. This is also pre-Great Recession, where there was certainly freer and less regulated access to student loans. And so that provided a source of liquidity for students to pay the cost of college, even if their family resources were perhaps more constrained. I think we at the Met, and my guess that many of your high schools felt that our role was to help students get in, perhaps help them make informed choices about where to attend, but then to give them a hug on graduation stage and send them on our way. We provided within the Met a limited amount of transition support for students when they were going into college, but of course at many schools that extends beyond school staffing ability. And so it was kind of beyond our ability to comprehensively support students as much as we might want to. And at the time, we didn't really have or know about data sources we could draw on to track students' progress through college. So again, going back about a decade when we were working with Professor Arnold to really understand our students' path to college, these are the kind of data points that stood out to us. We knew from our own data, because we could see where our students applied and celebrate their acceptances. Almost all of our students were accepted to college, and every year about 80% of them planned to go. And in the years prior to when we had the chance to work with Professor Arnold, of the students who came back and visited us, about 80% told us that they were in college. And so it seemed to us from student self-reports that most of the students, if not all of the students who were planning to go, were in fact enrolled. And so back in 2007, I as an administrator and my colleagues weren't as aware as we are now, and many of us are now, about the National Student Clearinghouse. And so Professor Arnold pointed this resource out to us. And so when we pulled the National Student Clearinghouse data, that allowed us to observe through administrative data sources enrollments, not just institutions in Rhode Island, but many institutions around the country, we saw a much lower rate of enrollment. And this really motivated us to focus on the summer between when students told us they were planning to go to college and the fall, a couple months later, when unfortunately a sizable share weren't enrolling, and see what we could do to close that gap. And I do want to point out that this summer melt phenomenon, as I mentioned before, is not unique to Providence and to the students in the Met where we observe this data. When my colleague Lindsay Page and I, our other colleagues of ours, have looked at rates of summer melt in other parts of the country, we have found similarly high melt rates. So 20% of students in Boston, 20% in Fulton County, Georgia, upwards of 30% in places like Dallas. So, I think in terms of informing how we might approach effectively supporting students through this critical time period, it's of course important to ask why students would melt in the first place. And what we've learned over lots of years of research and talking to practitioners and school leaders, also drawing on our own direct experience, is that even after being accepted to college and choosing where to attend, low-income students in particular have to complete a variety of complex tasks, everything from verifying the income and asset information they provide on their FAFSA, to evaluating and considering supplementary loan options, to paying unanticipated fees that arise, so a fee to attend orientation, a fee to apply for housing. And then on top of that, they're also completing a variety of procedural tasks, registering for orientation or placement tests, completing housing applications, deciding whether they can stay on their family's health insurance or use their institutional health insurance. And all of these tasks arise at a time where students typically have little access to professional assistance. So in the mid-2000s, at the Met, our counselors typically worked 9 or 10-month contracts like our teachers. Students had typically were not yet connected to supports available in their college. And we found, for the most part, that students' parents very much wanted to help them, but didn't have the direct experience to provide expert guidance.